Picture this. You're celebrating your fourth wedding anniversary at the most exclusive restaurant in town. Your husband is toasting to your beautiful future together, and suddenly a woman walks through the door who looks exactly like the deceased first wife you never knew existed. She approaches your table, sits down without invitation, and says with a smile that could freeze hell over, "Hello, Brandon, darling. Miss me?" The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of Meridian Grill as my entire world imploded in that single moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening had started so perfectly. Brandon looked handsome in his navy blazer, the one that brought out his steel blue eyes, and I felt radiant in the emerald dress he'd surprised me with that morning. 4 years, he'd whispered in my ear as we walked into Meridian Grill, Portland's most coveted dining establishment. And this is just the beginning, Rachel. His mother Patricia and father Robert were already seated at our reserved table, both dressed impeccably as always. Patricia wore her signature pearls and that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, while Robert maintained his usual stoic demeanor behind wire-rimmed glasses. The Hayes family had a reputation in Portland's elite circles. Robert's real estate empire had built half of the upscale developments in the metro area, and Patricia served on the boards of 3 different charities. They were the kind of people who appeared in the society pages of the Portland Tribune, always perfectly posed and radiating old money sophistication. When Brandon first introduced me to them 3 years earlier, I'd been intimidated by their polished exterior and careful way of speaking that made every conversation feel like a chess match. "Rachel, dear," Patricia had said that first meeting, looking me up and down with the precision of an appraiser, "Brandon tells us you work in marketing. How delightfully modern." The way she emphasized modern made it clear that my middle-class background and state school education were noted and filed away. But I was young and in love, determined to prove myself worthy of their son who seemed to walk on water in their eyes. Now, sitting in the golden glow of Meridian Grill's ambient lighting, I watched Brandon signal the sommelier for our champagne. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of Portland's wealthy, the soft clink of crystal and silverware creating an elegant symphony. Our table overlooked the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Willamette River snaking through downtown like a ribbon of black silk. Everything was perfect, orchestrated with the Hayes family's usual attention to detail and social positioning. "To 4 wonderful years," Brandon announced, raising his glass as the champagne arrived. His voice carried that confident tone I'd fallen in love with, the same one he used when closing million-dollar real estate deals. "And to my beautiful wife, who makes every day an adventure." Patricia and Robert raised their glasses with approving smiles, and for a moment I felt that familiar warmth of belonging I'd worked so hard to achieve. The crystal sang as our glasses touched, and Brandon leaned over to kiss my cheek, his cologne mixing with the scent of the restaurant's signature orchids. I should have noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. I should have caught the way his eyes darted toward the entrance every few minutes, or how Patricia's smile seemed more strained than usual. But I was lost in the romance of the moment, savoring what I believed was genuine happiness after years of feeling like an outsider trying to earn my place in their carefully constructed world. The first course arrived with fanfare, the chef personally presenting his signature appetizer to our table. Brandon had pulled strings to get us this reservation, calling in favors from his business connections. The Hayes family didn't just dine at restaurants, they experienced them, turning every meal into a social event that reinforced their status in the community. I'd learned to appreciate this lifestyle, though it sometimes felt performative rather than authentic. "Tell us about the new marketing campaign you're developing," Robert said, making conversation with the same measured interest he showed all topics. I launched into a description of my latest project, pleased to have something substantial to contribute to the conversation. Brandon nodded encouragingly, though I noticed he kept glancing at his phone, checking the time with increasing frequency. The main course was being served when it happened. I was laughing at something Patricia had said about the mayor's wife when the entire atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to shift. A hush fell over nearby tables, and I felt rather than saw heads turning toward the entrance. Brandon's fork clattered against his plate, his face draining of all color as he stared past me with an expression of absolute terror. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered, her composure cracking for the first time in the 3 years I'd known her. Robert's face hardened into granite, his jaw clenching with what looked like rage and fear combined. I turned to follow their gaze, expecting to see some sort of emergency or celebrity that had captured everyone's attention. Instead, I saw her. She was breathtaking in a way that made my chest tighten with instant recognition, though I'd never seen her before in my life. Tall and willowy, with platinum blonde hair that caught the restaurant's lighting like spun gold, she moved through the dining room with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Her black dress was simple but expensive, the kind of understated elegance that screamed money and class. But it was her face that stopped my heart. Delicate features arranged in perfect symmetry, with green eyes that seemed to hold secrets and a smile that managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. She walked directly to our table as if she owned not just the restaurant but the entire world around her. Every eye in the place followed her progress, conversations dying mid-sentence as Portland's elite recognized drama unfolding in their midst. The maitre d' started toward her with concern, clearly realizing this wasn't a planned addition to our party, but she waved him off with the casual authority of someone used to command. "Hello, Brandon, darling," she said in a voice like honey over broken glass, pulling out the empty chair at our table and sitting down without invitation. "Miss me?" The champagne flute slipped from my fingers before I could think to grip it tighter, crystal exploding against the marble floor in a shower of glass and golden liquid. The sound seemed to release the spell that had fallen over our table, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Brandon lurched backward in his chair as if she'd struck him. Patricia gasped audibly while Robert half rose from his seat with fury radiating from every line of his body. "Caroline," Brandon breathed, and in that single word, I heard the collapse of everything I thought I knew about my life. The way he said her name with terror and longing and guilt all twisted together, told me more than any explanation could have. This wasn't some business associate or family friend. This was someone who had once been everything to him. Someone whose very existence in this moment meant that nothing about my marriage was what I'd believed it to be. "Surprised to see me?" Caroline asked, her green eyes dancing with amusement as she surveyed the destruction her presence had caused. She looked at Patricia with particular relish, noting the older woman's white-knuckled grip on her napkin and the way Robert seemed to be struggling for breath. "I thought it was time for a family reunion. After all, we have so much catching up to do. You're supposed to be," Patricia started, then caught herself, glancing around the restaurant with the awareness that dozens of people were hanging on every word. "Dead?" Caroline finished sweetly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear clearly. "Yes, I imagine that would have been more convenient for everyone. Unfortunately, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, as they say." She gestured to the waiter who was hovering uncertainly nearby. "Could I get a glass of champagne? I believe we're celebrating something tonight." I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" Caroline turned to me with interest, as if noticing me for the first time. Her gaze traveled over my face with the intensity of someone memorizing details, and I felt exposed under that emerald scrutiny. "Oh, you poor thing," she said with what might have been genuine sympathy. "You really don't know, do you? I'm Caroline Winters. Well, I was Caroline Hayes when I married your husband 6 years ago, before I supposedly died in that tragic accident that Patricia and Robert orchestrated so beautifully." The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation stealing more oxygen from my lungs. Married to Brandon 6 years ago. That would have been 2 years before I even met him, back when he was still the mysterious bachelor with a tragic past that his family rarely discussed. I'd been told that he'd lost someone important in a car accident, someone he preferred not to talk about because the pain was still too fresh. The grieving widower narrative had actually made me love him more, touched by his depth of feeling and his ability to love again despite his loss. "That's impossible," I managed to say, though even as the words left my mouth, pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. The photo albums Patricia had quickly hidden when I visited their home. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Brandon's nightmares in the first year of our marriage, when he'd wake up calling out for someone whose name I could never quite make out. "Brandon told me she died in a car accident. He's been grieving her for years." "Oh, he has been grieving," Caroline agreed, accepting the champagne glass the waiter brought with trembling hands. "But not for the reasons you think. You see, Brandon and his loving parents here staged my death rather beautifully. Car over a bridge, body never recovered, tragic loss of a young wife who was supposedly depressed and suicidal. What they didn't count on was that I might survive the crash they engineered and decide to disappear rather than come forward immediately." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Every conversation halted as the drama at our table became the evening's main entertainment. I could see phones being discreetly raised, capturing what would undoubtedly become Portland's most talked-about scandal by morning. The Hayes family valued their reputation above all else, and Caroline's public return was destroying decades of carefully maintained image control in real time. Brandon finally found his voice, though it cracked with strain. "Caroline, please, not here, we can talk privately. Work something out. Work something out." Caroline's laugh was like wind chimes made of ice. "Oh, Brandon, we're far beyond that point. You see, I've spent the last 4 years rebuilding my life, becoming someone new, learning to live with what you all did to me, but watching you play happy families while I was supposed to stay conveniently dead, that became harder to stomach than I expected." She reached into her elegant clutch and pulled out a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table between us with deliberate ceremony. "I've brought some reading material. Our original marriage certificate for starters. Insurance policies taken out in my name just months before my convenient accident, and my personal favorite, bank records showing payments made to a very interesting gentleman who specializes in automotive sabotage." Patricia's face had gone from white to green, and she was gripping the edge of the table so hard I thought she might crack the marble. "You can't prove anything," she said, in a voice that shook despite her attempt at control. "No one will believe you after all this time. Won't they?" Caroline smiled, and this time there was nothing beautiful about it. The expression was pure predator, and I realized I was watching someone who had spent years planning this exact moment. "I think you underestimate how much Portland society loves a good scandal, especially one involving the prestigious Hayes family. And I have so much more evidence than what's in this little envelope." She turned back to me, and I saw something like pity in those green eyes. "Rachel, isn't it? I want you to understand that none of this is your fault. You were just another pawn in their game, another way to legitimize Brandon's new life and keep their reputation intact. But your marriage is built on fraud, literally and figuratively. Brandon never divorced me because Patricia convinced him I was dead and he didn't need to. Which makes your wedding ceremony a delightful bit of theater, but not legally binding." The words hit me like a tsunami, washing away 4 years of life I thought I'd built, not legally married. Brandon had another wife, this woman sitting across from me who was supposed to be dead but was very much alive, and apparently had enough evidence to destroy everything. I thought about our house, our shared accounts, the future we'd planned together. All of it suddenly felt like quicksand beneath my feet. "You're lying," I said desperately, though even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. "This is some kind of elaborate hoax or blackmail scheme. People don't just fake their own deaths and come back 4 years later. Don't they?" Caroline pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like hundreds of photos. "Here I am in the hospital after the crash, broken ribs and a concussion but very much alive. Here's my new driver's license under my current name, and here's my marriage certificate to Dr. James Reed, whom I married 2 years ago in Seattle when I finally felt safe enough to build a real life again." She showed me each image with methodical precision, building her case like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The hospital photos were brutal. A woman who looked exactly like her, bandaged and broken but unmistakably breathing. The documents looked official, bearing seals and signatures that would be difficult to fake. And the wedding photos showed Caroline in white, radiant and happy beside a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes. "I've been Caroline Reed for 2 years now," she continued conversationally. "My husband James knows everything about my past, and he's been incredibly supportive of my decision to finally come forward. You see, we recently found out we're expecting our first child, and I realized I couldn't bring a baby into this world while this lie continued to poison everything around it." Brandon's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back from the table, looking like he might be sick. "Caroline, I thought you were dead. We all did. The car went over the bridge, they searched for days." "Oh, I went over the bridge, all right." Caroline's voice turned cold as winter steel. "After someone cut my brake lines and made sure I was driving that particular route at that particular time. I managed to get out of the car before it sank completely, and I made a choice in that moment. I could surface and accuse my loving husband and in-laws of attempted murder, or I could disappear and see what they did with their freedom." She gestured around the restaurant with elegant disdain. "Clearly you wasted no time replacing me. How long did you wait, Brandon? 6 months? A year? When did you start telling people I was the tragic love of your life who died too young?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself studying Brandon's face for denial that never came. Instead, I saw guilt written in every line of his expression, confirmation of truths I wasn't ready to accept. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my entire future, had been living a lie so elaborate it made my head spin. "The prenup," I whispered, remembering suddenly how insistent Patricia had been about the agreement before our wedding. "You made me sign a prenup that left me with almost nothing if we divorced." "Very good," Caroline said approvingly. "I'm sure they told you it was just a formality, protecting the family business. In reality, it was protecting them from having to split assets with someone who wasn't legally entitled to them anyway." "Quite clever, really." Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as a harsh growl. "What do you want?" Caroline's smile widened, and I realized this was the question she'd been waiting for. "Justice would be nice, but I'll settle for truth. I want Brandon to publicly acknowledge that our marriage never ended, that he committed bigamy when he went through that ceremony with Rachel. I want the return of all assets that were supposed to be mine, including the life insurance money you collected when I was declared dead, and I want a very public apology for the hell you put me through." She stood gracefully, leaving the envelope on the table like a time bomb set to explode. "You have 48 hours to decide how you want to handle this. We can do it quietly through lawyers, or we can do it in the court of public opinion. Either way, the truth is coming out." Caroline looked at me one last time, and I saw genuine compassion in her expression. "Rachel, you seem like a lovely person who got caught up in something terrible. I hope you'll find the strength to get away from these people before they destroy you the way they tried to destroy me." She paused, then added quietly, "And you might want to check your own brake lines before you drive home tonight." With that, she walked away as elegantly as she'd arrived, leaving behind a table full of shattered people and a restaurant full of witnesses who would be dining out on this story for months to come. The silence stretched until Patricia broke it with a sound somewhere between a sob and a snarl. "That vindictive witch," she hissed, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. "We should have made sure she was really dead." The words hung in the air like a confession, and I stared at the woman who had welcomed me into her family, who had helped plan my wedding, who had spoken those words with such casual malice that my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Everything I thought I knew about the Hayes family, about my marriage, about my own life, had just been revealed as an elaborate fiction designed to cover up attempted murder. I stood up on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I picked up my purse. The envelope Caroline had left seemed to pulse with dangerous energy, full of truths that would reshape everything I thought I understood about the world. "Rachel," Brandon said desperately, reaching for my hand. "Let me explain. It's not what you think." "Don't touch me," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Don't ever touch me again." As I walked through the silent restaurant, past tables full of Portland's elite, who were already crafting the story they'd tell about the night the Hayes family's perfect facade crumbled, I felt something inside me hardening. The naive woman who had walked into Meridian Grill that evening was gone, replaced by someone who had just learned that survival sometimes required becoming someone new entirely. The valet brought my car with unusual speed, probably eager to avoid the drama still unfolding inside. As I drove through the Portland streets that had felt like home just hours earlier, Caroline's final warning echoed in my mind. "Check your brake lines." The suggestion that my own safety might be at risk hadn't occurred to me, but as I thought about Patricia's casual comment about making sure Caroline was really dead, a chill of fear joined the anger churning in my chest. By the time I reached our house in Hillsdale, the Victorian that now felt like a stage set for a play I'd never auditioned for, I knew with crystal clarity that my old life was over. The question was what kind of person I would become in whatever came next, and whether I would have the strength to uncover the full truth about the family I'd married into. The manila envelope sat on my passenger seat like evidence in a murder trial, which I was beginning to suspect it actually was. Tomorrow I would open it and begin the process of learning who I really was, beneath the identity the Hayes family had crafted for me. Tonight, I would grieve for the woman who had trusted them and prepare for the war I was about to fight for my own survival. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caroline's face across that restaurant table, heard Patricia's chilling words about making sure she was really dead, felt the ground of my entire existence crumbling beneath my feet. I sat in our king-size bed, the bed I'd shared with a man who was apparently still married to someone else, clutching the manila envelope like a lifeline to sanity. Brandon never came home. At 3 in the morning, I received a text that was so perfectly him it almost made me laugh. "Staying at parents' house tonight. We need to talk when emotions aren't so high. This can all be worked out." Even in crisis, he was trying to manage the situation, control the narrative, make this catastrophe into something that could be resolved with the right strategy and enough money. But as I sat there in the darkness of what I now understood was a house built on lies, I realized I didn't want it worked out. I wanted the truth, all of it, no matter how ugly or complicated. Caroline had given me a gift in that restaurant, even if it felt like a bomb exploding in my hands. She'd shown me that everything I thought I knew was fiction, and for the first time in 4 years, I had the chance to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's carefully constructed world. Dawn was breaking over Portland when I finally opened the envelope. My hands trembled as I spread the contents across our dining room table, the same table where I'd planned dinner parties designed to impress Brandon's business associates, where I'd signed Christmas cards as Mrs. Hayes, where I'd dreamed about the family we might build together someday. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was dismantling my marriage in the same space where I'd worked so hard to perfect it. The marriage certificate was the first document that caught my attention. There it was in black and white, Brandon Hayes and Caroline Elizabeth Winters, married in a small ceremony at Cannon Beach on a sunny day in September, 6 years ago. The signatures looked authentic, the seal official, the date stamp clear. This wasn't some elaborate forgery. This was legal documentation of a marriage that had never been dissolved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I studied the photograph attached to the certificate, a small snapshot of the couple signing their names with ocean waves in the background. Brandon looked younger, happier somehow, his smile genuine in a way I'd rarely seen in our own wedding photos. Caroline was radiant in a simple white dress, her blonde hair caught in the sea breeze, her face glowing with the kind of joy that couldn't be faked. They looked like people in love, not actors playing roles in someone else's script. The insurance documents were next, and they made my stomach turn. 3 different policies had been taken out on Caroline's life in the 6 months before her supposed death, totaling nearly $2 million. The beneficiary on all 3 was Brandon, with Patricia Hayes listed as the secondary. The timing was suspicious enough, but the amounts were staggering. Who takes out multiple life insurance policies on a healthy 26-year-old woman unless they're planning something? Bank records showed transfers I couldn't begin to understand, money moving between accounts I'd never heard of, payments to companies with names that meant nothing to me. But one name appeared repeatedly in the weeks leading up to Caroline's accident: Morrison Automotive Services. A quick internet search on my phone revealed that Morrison Automotive had been shut down 5 years ago after the owner, Gerald Morrison, was convicted of insurance fraud involving staged accidents. The pieces were falling into place like dominoes, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy Caroline had survived. This wasn't a family protecting their reputation. This was organized criminal activity. The Hayes family had attempted to murder their daughter-in-law for insurance money. And when that failed, they'd simply pretended she was dead and moved on with their lives. I thought about all the times Patricia had mentioned how tragic it was that Brandon's first wife had been so troubled, so prone to depression and reckless behavior. The narrative they'd crafted painted Caroline as unstable, making her eventual suicide seem plausible to anyone who asked questions. They'd murdered her character before attempting to murder her body, creating a story that would satisfy investigators and insurance companies alike. The final document in the envelope was a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery with Caroline's maiden name embossed at the top. It was addressed to me, written in elegant script that somehow managed to be both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Dear Rachel," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've chosen to face the truth rather than live in the comfortable lie they built around you. I admire that courage, because I know how seductive their world can be when you're inside it. I was you once, young, in love, desperate to belong to something that seemed so much grander than anything I'd known before. The Hayes family has a gift for making you feel chosen, special, like you've won some cosmic lottery by being allowed into their circle. Patricia will shower you with attention and advice, making you feel like the daughter she never had while slowly reshaping you into someone more suitable for their image. Robert will treat you with the kind of distant respect that makes his rare moments of approval feel like precious gifts. And Brandon will make you feel like you're the center of his universe, while keeping you carefully positioned on the edges of his real life. I fell for all of it, just like you did. I let them plan my wedding, choose my dress, select the guest list, even pick the flowers. I thought their involvement meant acceptance, that I was finally part of something permanent and beautiful. What I didn't realize was that I was being groomed, prepared for a role that would ultimately require my disappearance when I became inconvenient. The first red flag should have been how quickly they wanted me to sign over power of attorney for medical decisions. Patricia said it was just a precaution, given that my own family lived across the country. The second was how insistent they were about the life insurance policies, claiming it was responsible financial planning for a young married couple. The third was Brandon's sudden interest in hiking dangerous trails and taking weekend trips to places with treacherous roads. But I was so busy trying to be the perfect Hayes wife that I missed all the signs. I focused on charity work, social events, playing the role they'd designed for me while they planned my exit from the stage. The night of the accident, Patricia had called insisting I drive across town to handle some crisis with their accountant. She was very specific about which route I should take, even drawing me a map because the GPS might take you on those awful busy streets. When my brakes failed on that winding road above the Willamette, when my car crashed through the guardrail and plunged toward the dark water below, my last coherent thought was that this couldn't be an accident. The brake lines had been cut too cleanly, the timing too convenient, the route too perfectly chosen for maximum lethality and minimum witnesses. I should have died that night, Rachel. The car was supposed to sink completely, taking me with it, leaving just enough evidence to confirm my death without providing too much for investigators to examine. But something went wrong with their plan. Maybe Gerald Morrison cut the wrong brake line, or maybe the water wasn't as deep as they'd calculated. I managed to get out of the sinking car, swim to shore, and crawl into the woods where I spent 3 days deciding whether to surface as Caroline Hayes or disappear forever. I chose disappearance, partly from fear and partly from curiosity. I wanted to see what they would do with their freedom, how they would explain my death, what story they would tell about the wife who had become too inconvenient to keep alive. The answer, as you now know, was that they would replace me entirely, find someone new to fill the role I'd vacated. I've watched from a distance as they integrated you into their world, using the same techniques they'd used on me. I've seen you at charity events, photographed in the society pages, playing the part of the perfect Hayes daughter-in-law with the same desperate enthusiasm I'd once brought to the role. And I felt guilty, knowing that my silence was enabling them to victimize another innocent woman. But I needed time to build a case, to gather evidence, to become strong enough to face them without being destroyed in the process. I needed to become someone other than the naive girl who'd trusted her in-laws with her life and nearly paid the ultimate price for that trust. My new husband James knows everything about my past, and he's been incredibly supportive of my decision to finally come forward. We're expecting our first child in 6 months, and the idea of bringing a baby into the world while this lie continued to poison everything around it became unbearable. Children deserve truth, even when it's complicated and painful. I'm telling you all this because you deserve to know what you're up against. The Hayes family doesn't just ruin people, they erase them. If you choose to fight them, you need to be prepared for them to use every resource at their disposal to discredit you, isolate you, and potentially harm you. They've already proven they're capable of attempted murder. Don't underestimate what they might do to protect their secrets. But you also need to know that you're not alone in this. I've spent 4 years documenting their crimes, building relationships with people who can help, preparing for the day when I could finally bring them to justice. If you're brave enough to join me, we can expose them together. If you're not, I understand completely. Just please get away from them before they decide you know too much to live. Whatever you choose, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You were a victim from the moment you met Brandon, targeted specifically because you were vulnerable, isolated, and desperate to belong somewhere. The love you felt was real, even if everything else was constructed. Don't let their betrayal make you doubt your own capacity for love and trust. Be careful, Rachel. And if you decide you want the truth badly enough to fight for it, call the number I've written on the back of this letter. There are people waiting to help you, but only if you're ready to help yourself. The letter was signed simply Caroline, but at the bottom she'd added a phone number and an address in Seattle. I stared at those 10 digits, realizing they represented a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of my future. I could call Brandon's family, try to work out some kind of arrangement that would let me exit this marriage quietly and safely. Or I could call Caroline and join whatever war she was preparing to wage against the people who had tried to kill her. My phone buzzed with another text from Brandon. I know you're confused and hurt, but Caroline is not stable. She's been planning this revenge for years. We can protect you if you let us help. Don't do anything rash. The irony of Brandon warning me about Caroline's instability while asking me to trust the family that had attempted murder was so complete it almost made me laugh. But there was also something threatening in his tone, a suggestion that their protection was contingent on my cooperation. The loving husband mask was slipping, revealing something calculating underneath. I walked through our house one more time, seeing it with new eyes. The family photos that had always seemed slightly staged, the expensive furniture that Patricia had insisted we needed to maintain appearances, the artwork that reflected the Hayes family taste rather than my own. Nothing in this space was really mine except the few personal items I'd managed to maintain despite their subtle pressure to upgrade everything. In Brandon's home office, I found things I'd never noticed before. A small framed photo tucked behind his computer monitor showed him with a woman who definitely wasn't me. Blonde hair, green eyes, the same delicate features I'd seen on Caroline last night. She was laughing at something off camera, her face bright with genuine happiness, and Brandon was looking at her like she hung the moon. The photo was dated just 3 months before her supposed death. His desk drawers revealed more secrets, business cards for private investigators, a file folder labeled trust issues that contained what looked like surveillance reports, and a prepaid cell phone I'd never seen before. One of the surveillance reports had my name on it, detailing my daily routines, my friendships, even my therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez. They'd been watching me, documenting my life like scientists studying a lab rat. The prepaid phone's call history showed regular contact with numbers I didn't recognize, but one name in the recent calls made my blood freeze: Gerald Morrison, the same Gerald Morrison whose automotive company had been convicted of insurance fraud. The same man who had presumably cut Caroline's brake lines. Brandon had been in contact with him as recently as last week. I thought about Caroline's warning about checking my own brake lines, about her suggestion that I might become too inconvenient to keep alive. Suddenly, every car trip I'd taken in the past month seemed suspicious. Had there been times when my brakes felt soft, when the pedal went further to the floor than usual? I'd mentioned it to Brandon once, and he'd dismissed it as normal wear, promising to have the car serviced soon. With trembling fingers, I grabbed my keys and headed to the garage. Our house came with a 2-car garage, but Brandon's Mercedes took up most of the space, leaving my Honda Civic squeezed against the wall. I crawled underneath my car with the flashlight from our emergency kit, not really knowing what I was looking for but desperate to confirm or dismiss the fear growing in my chest. I didn't have to look long. Even with my limited mechanical knowledge, I could see that something was wrong with the brake lines. They weren't cut through completely like Caroline's must have been, but there were clear scratches in the metal coating, and one line showed signs of recent tampering. Someone had been working on my car, and it hadn't been a legitimate mechanic. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to discredit me or drive me away, they were preparing to kill me. Brandon's family had tried to murder Caroline when she became inconvenient, and now they were setting up the same fate for me. How long had they been planning this? How close had I come to dying in what would have looked like a tragic accident? I crawled out from under the car and sat on the concrete floor of the garage, Caroline's letter still clutched in my hand. The choice was no longer between staying in a complicated marriage or starting over somewhere new. The choice was between fighting for my life or accepting that I might not live to see another anniversary. Standing on shaking legs, I walked back into the house and dialed the number Caroline had provided. It rang twice before a warm male voice answered. "Daniel speaking. Is this? I got this number from Caroline. My name is Rachel Thompson. Well, Rachel Hayes, I guess, though apparently that's not legal." I was babbling, the stress of the past 12 hours finally overwhelming my ability to maintain composure. "Rachel," the voice said gently, and I heard relief mixed with concern. "Caroline told me you might call. I'm Daniel Winters, Caroline's brother. Are you somewhere safe right now?" "I don't think anywhere is safe," I admitted, looking around the house that had felt like home until yesterday. "I found evidence that they've tampered with my car." Caroline was right about checking the brake lines. "Jesus," Daniel muttered, and I heard papers rustling in the background. "Listen carefully, Rachel. I need you to pack a bag with essentials only. Documents, medications, anything you can't replace. Don't use your regular luggage, use something they wouldn't recognize. Can you get to Pioneer Courthouse Square within the hour?" "I think so, but how do I know I can trust you? How do I know this isn't some elaborate scheme?" Daniel's voice softened. "Because Caroline almost died 4 years ago, and we've been waiting ever since for the chance to make sure it never happens again. Because you're not the first woman they've targeted, Just the first one who's lived long enough to hear the truth, and because right now I'm the only person in Portland who wants to keep you alive more than the Hayes family wants you dead." The stark honesty of his words cut through my remaining doubts. I was already in danger. The question was whether I would face it alone or with allies who understood what I was up against. "1 hour," I agreed. "How will I recognize you?" "I'll be wearing a blue jacket and carrying a newspaper. I look like Caroline but with shorter hair and fewer trust issues." "Rachel?" "Yes?" "Don't tell anyone where you're going, don't use your credit cards, don't stop at ATMs or anywhere you're a regular customer. They've had 4 years to establish surveillance networks around you, and they're probably activating all of them right now." After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen. The kitchen where I'd cooked countless meals for a man who was planning my death and tried to process the magnitude of what I was about to do. I was walking away from everything I'd built in Portland, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed was my life. But I was also walking toward the truth, toward justice, and toward the possibility of becoming someone real instead of someone designed. I packed quickly, choosing documents over clothes, practicality over sentimentality. My grandmother's ring, the one piece of jewelry that was truly mine, my passport, birth certificate, and the few financial documents I could find, the letter from Caroline and all the evidence she'd provided, a change of clothes and basic toiletries. As I was leaving, I caught sight of our wedding album on the living room bookshelf. I opened it to the page where Brandon and I were cutting the cake, both of us smiling broadly for the camera. Looking at it now, I could see the performance in our poses, the way Patricia was directing the photographer from the sidelines, the careful staging of every moment. Even our wedding had been more about image than emotion. I closed the album and left it on the table. That woman in the white dress, the one who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings, was gone. Whoever I became next would be someone who understood that survival sometimes required walking away from everything you thought you wanted in order to claim something you actually needed. The drive to Pioneer Courthouse Square took forever, and no time at all. Every car behind me looked suspicious, every red light felt like a trap, every turn seemed to bring new dangers. But as I parked several blocks away and walked toward the meeting point, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of choosing my own path. Daniel was exactly where he'd said he'd be, and Caroline had been right about the family resemblance. He had the same green eyes, the same elegant bone structure, but where Caroline carried herself like someone who'd been tested by fire, Daniel had an easier confidence that suggested he'd been loved unconditionally from birth. When he saw me approaching, his face lit up with a smile that reached his eyes. "Rachel," he said, standing to greet me, "thank you for being brave enough to make this call." "I'm not sure brave is the right word," I admitted, accepting his offered handshake. "Desperate might be more accurate." "Sometimes they're the same thing," he replied gently. "Are you ready to learn the whole truth about what you've been living with?" I thought about Caroline's letter, about the evidence in the manila envelope, about the scratched brake lines under my car. I thought about Patricia's casual comment about making sure Caroline was really dead, about Brandon's surveillance reports, about 4 years of living a lie designed by people who saw me as disposable. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. Daniel smiled and gestured toward a coffee shop across the square. "Then let's go meet the rest of the team." The coffee shop Daniel led me to was tucked into a corner building I'd passed hundreds of times but never really noticed. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and deliberately unremarkable, the kind of place where conversations could happen without drawing attention. Daniel guided me to a booth in the back corner where a woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes was already waiting, a laptop open in front of her and several manila folders stacked beside her coffee cup. "Rachel, I'd like you to meet Margaret Chen," Daniel said as we settled into the booth. "She's a private investigator who's been working Caroline's case since the beginning." Margaret stood to shake my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. There was something about her presence that immediately made me feel safer, as if I'd found an adult in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness but refused to become cynical about it. "But I'm glad Caroline finally decided to come forward. We've been building this case for a long time." "How long?" I asked, settling into the booth and accepting the coffee Daniel offered me. My hands were still shaking slightly, adrenaline from the morning's discoveries making it hard to sit still. 4 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Margaret replied without hesitation. That's how long it's been since Caroline walked into my office, soaking wet and scared out of her mind, asking me to help her disappear. She'd been hiding in the woods for 3 days after the accident, trying to decide whether to surface or vanish completely. Margaret opened one of the folders and spread photographs across the table. They showed Caroline in various stages of recovery, bruised and bandaged in a hospital bed, learning to walk again with a physical therapist, eventually smiling as she signed documents that I assumed were related to her new identity. The progression was heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. The Hayes family had covered their tracks well. Margaret continued, Gerald Morrison, the man they hired to sabotage Caroline's car, had died in prison 6 months after her accident. Convenient heart attack, no witnesses, no way to trace the connection back to them. The insurance companies had paid out without question, accepting the story about a troubled young woman who'd taken her own life. But Caroline survived, I said, studying the photos of her recovery. In the early pictures, she looked broken in ways that went beyond physical injury. But the later ones showed a strength I recognized from the woman who'd walked into Meridian Grill last night. Barely, Daniel interjected, his voice tight with old anger. She had 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and hypothermia from the river water. If she hadn't been such a strong swimmer, if the current had been different that night, if she hadn't managed to grab onto that fallen tree, he shook his head. There were a dozen ways she should have died in that water. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one thick with legal documents and financial records. We've spent the past 4 years building an airtight case against the Hayes family. Bank records showing payments to Morrison, insurance policies taken out just before the accident, witness statements from people who saw Brandon and Patricia scouting that particular stretch of road in the weeks before Caroline's crash. She handed me a photograph of a man in coveralls, standing next to a tow truck. This is Danny Rodriguez, the mechanic who found Caroline's car after it was pulled from the river. He noticed immediately that the brake lines had been cut, but when he reported it to the investigating officer, he was told the case was already closed. Rodriguez kept detailed photos anyway, and he's willing to testify about what he found. The investigating officer, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Let me guess. Someone with connections to the Hayes family. Detective William Hayes, Margaret confirmed grimly. Robert's younger brother. He made sure the investigation was superficial, the evidence was mishandled, and the case was closed quickly. He's since retired to a very comfortable house in Arizona, purchased with money that far exceeds what a police detective should have been able to afford. The scope of the conspiracy was overwhelming. This wasn't just a family covering up attempted murder. This was a network of corruption that reached into law enforcement, insurance companies, and who knew where else. I thought about all the times Patricia had mentioned the family's connections, their ability to get things done that other people couldn't manage. Now I understood what she'd really been talking about. What about me? I asked, the question I'd been dreading. How long have they been planning to do the same thing to me? Daniel and Margaret exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears. Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up what looked like surveillance footage. We've been monitoring their communications for the past 18 months, she said, turning the screen so I could see. The planning began about 6 months ago, after you started asking questions about Brandon's first marriage. I remembered those questions, casual inquiries about the woman he'd lost, expressions of sympathy for his grief that had been met with increasingly uncomfortable silences. I'd thought I was being supportive. Apparently I'd been signing my own death warrant. The timeline accelerated 3 months ago when you mentioned wanting to have children, Margaret continued. That's when they started making serious preparations. They couldn't risk you getting pregnant and creating another complication in their lives. The coffee in my mouth turned bitter. Even my dreams of starting a family had been seen as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Every conversation I'd had with Brandon about our future together had been a negotiation for my own survival, though I'd been too naive to realize it. They were going to wait until after your anniversary, Daniel added quietly. Patricia was very specific about the timing in her communications with Morrison's replacement. She wanted the insurance claim to seem more believable if you died shortly after what appeared to be a happy celebration of your marriage. Morrison's replacement? I felt sick thinking about how organized their operation was, how they'd found someone new to handle their dirty work after their first hired killer died. Marcus Webb, Margaret said, pulling up another file. He runs a garage in Southeast Portland under the name Webb Auto Repair, but his real specialty is making accidents look authentic. We've been tracking his communications with the Hayes family for months. She showed me printed emails that made my skin crawl. Webb and Patricia discussing the best methods for break-line sabotage, timing for maximum effectiveness, even cleanup procedures to ensure no evidence would remain. They talked about my death like they were planning a dinner party, with the same attention to detail and casual disregard for anything other than their own convenience. "There's something else," Daniel said hesitantly. "Something Caroline wasn't sure she should tell you last night, but that you need to know if you're going to understand what you're really up against." I braced myself for another revelation, though I wasn't sure how much more I could absorb. "What is it?" "You weren't their first choice as Brandon's second wife," Margaret said gently. "There was another woman, about 2 years after Caroline's supposed death. Her name was Lisa Martinez, and she was perfect for their requirements. Young, isolated, grateful to be included in their world." The folder Margaret opened contained photographs of a beautiful Latina woman with dark hair and warm eyes. She was pictured at various Hayes family events, always smiling, always perfectly dressed, always looking like she belonged in their polished world. "What happened to her?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. "Car accident," Daniel said grimly. "Single vehicle crash on a mountain road outside the city. Brake failure. She'd been married to Brandon for 8 months. The room seemed to spin around me as the implications sank in. Liza Martinez hadn't been their practice run, she'd been their second victim. Caroline had survived by chance and determination, but Lisa hadn't been so lucky, and I was supposed to be their third success, the woman who would finally give them the perfect murder they'd been refining for years. "Jesus," I whispered, staring at Lisa's photograph. She looked so alive, so happy, so completely unaware that she was living on borrowed time. "How many people know about this?" "Very few," Margaret admitted. "Lisa's family lives in California, and they accepted the accident report without question. The Hayes family played the grieving relatives perfectly, even establishing a scholarship in her memory. It was actually quite touching if you didn't know they'd murdered her. But you have evidence." "We have patterns, circumstances, and a growing body of documentation," Margaret said carefully. "What we need is someone willing to go on record, someone with direct access to the Hayes family who can help us prove the connections we've established." The weight of what she was asking settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. They wanted me to become their inside source, to go back into the lion's den and gather evidence while pretending everything was normal. The idea terrified me, but I also understood that it might be the only way to get justice for Caroline, Lisa, and who knew how many other women the Hayes family had targeted. "What exactly would that involve?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need access to their private communications, financial records, and evidence of their current relationship with Marcus Webb. Most importantly, we need documentation of their plans for you specifically, something that proves intent rather than just suspicious circumstances." "You want me to spy on them," I said flatly. "We want you to document their crimes," Margaret corrected. "Everything we've gathered so far is circumstantial. We can prove they have motive, means, and opportunity, but we need evidence of active conspiracy, the kind of evidence that only someone with intimate access to their lives could provide." A new voice joined the conversation from the booth behind us. "It's not as dangerous as it sounds if you're smart about it." I turned to see Caroline sliding into the booth beside Margaret, her appearance so dramatically different from the previous night that I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the elegant black dress and sophisticated styling. Instead, she wore jeans and a simple sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face free of makeup. She looked younger, more relaxed, and somehow more real than the woman who'd confronted us at Meridian Grill. "Caroline," I said, relief and apprehension warring in my voice. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up. I wasn't sure you'd call," she replied with a small smile. "But I'm glad you did, and I'm glad you're ready to hear the whole truth." She settled into the booth as if joining friends for a casual lunch, but her presence changed the entire dynamic of our conversation. This wasn't just about building a case anymore. This was about 2 women who'd been targeted by the same family, who'd survived their attempts at erasure, and who were preparing to fight back together. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," I told her, "about how they groom women for this role, how they make you feel chosen while they're really just preparing you for disposal. Looking back, I can see all the ways they've been controlling my life, shaping me into someone more convenient for their purposes." Caroline nodded knowingly. "The charity work they steered you toward, the social events they insisted you attend, The way they gradually isolated you from your old friends while introducing you to people in their circle. They're very good at making you feel like you're rising in the world while they're actually making you more dependent on them. I gave up my job, I realized aloud, the memory hitting me like a physical blow. 6 months after we got married, Patricia convinced me that Brandon made enough money for both of us, that my career was causing unnecessary stress in our relationship. She made it sound like luxury, like freedom, but really she was making sure I couldn't support myself independently. They did the same thing to Lisa, Margaret added quietly, and to Caroline before her accident. It's part of their pattern. Isolate the target, make them financially dependent, then create circumstances that make their death seem tragic but believable. Caroline reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The difference is that now we know what they're doing, and we have the resources to fight back. You're not alone in this, Rachel. You have allies who understand exactly what you're going through. What's the plan? I asked, looking around the table at these 3 people who'd somehow become my lifeline in the space of a few hours. Daniel pulled out a small device that looked like a cross between a cell phone and a computer. This is a recording device that looks exactly like a regular smartphone, he explained. It'll capture audio and video of any conversation you have while carrying it, and it uploads everything automatically to a secure server we control. We need you to go back to Brandon and his family, Margaret said carefully. Tell them you were shocked and upset by Caroline's return, but that you've had time to think and you want to work through this situation together. Let them believe you're buying their version of events. What is their version of events? I asked, realizing I'd walked out of Meridian Grill before hearing their explanation. Caroline's expression darkened. They'll tell you I'm mentally unstable. Probably claim I'm seeking revenge because Brandon chose to move on with his life instead of waiting for me to return. They'll paint me as vindictive and possibly dangerous, someone who's spent years planning this elaborate scheme to destroy their happiness. They'll also try to isolate you from any outside support, Daniel added. They'll suggest that people might try to take advantage of your confusion, that you shouldn't trust anyone except family, that the situation requires absolute discretion to protect everyone involved. And if I agree to help you, what exactly am I looking for? Margaret opened her laptop again and pulled up a checklist. Communications with Marcus Webb or any other service providers who might be handling the mechanical sabotage. Financial records showing payments for services that don't match legitimate business expenses. Any documentation of their surveillance on you, which we know exists. And most importantly, any evidence that they're actively planning your accident. How long would this take? Not long, Caroline said reassuringly. They're probably panicking right now, trying to figure out how to handle my return and what it means for their plans. They'll be making mistakes, having conversations they should keep private, leaving digital trails they'd normally be more careful about. If you can get back into their inner circle within the next few days, you should be able to gather what we need relatively quickly. I thought about the house I'd left that morning, about the scratched brake lines under my car, about Brandon's text messages trying to manage the situation. The idea of going back there, of pretending to trust people who were actively planning my murder, made my stomach churn. But I also thought about Lisa Martinez, about the scholarship they'd established in her memory while knowing they'd killed her, about all the other women who might be targeted if the Hayes family wasn't stopped. If I do this, I said slowly, if I help you gather this evidence, what happens next? How does this end? With justice, Margaret said firmly. We turn everything over to federal authorities. The FBI has a task force that specializes in conspiracy cases like this. The Hayes family goes to prison, their assets are seized to compensate their victims, and their ability to hurt anyone else ends permanently. And Caroline's marriage to Brandon gets officially dissolved, your own bigamous marriage gets annulled, and you get to start over with a clean slate, Daniel added. Plus, you'll likely be entitled to significant financial compensation from their estate once the criminal proceedings are complete. Caroline leaned forward, her green eyes serious. But I want you to understand that this isn't without risks. If they suspect you're working against them, they might accelerate their timeline. We'll be monitoring everything as closely as we can, but there will be moments when you're truly on your own with people who've already proven they're willing to kill. What about police protection? Can't law enforcement keep me safe while I gather evidence? Margaret shook her head grimly. Not with Detective William Hayes involved in the initial cover-up. We don't know how deep the corruption goes in the Portland Police Department, and we can't risk alerting the wrong people about our investigation. The federal task force will provide protection once we have enough evidence to move forward, but until then, your safety depends on maintaining your cover. The magnitude of what they were asking hit me fully. I would essentially be going undercover in my own life, pretending to be the naive wife while documenting evidence of my planned murder, surrounded by people who'd already killed at least one woman and were preparing to kill me. The danger was real and immediate, but so was the chance to stop them permanently. "There's one more thing you should know," Caroline said quietly. "Daniel and I will be staying in Portland while this is happening. We'll be close enough to help if you need us, monitoring the situation constantly, ready to extract you if things go wrong. You won't be doing this alone." I looked around the table at these three people who'd become my allies in the space of a few hours. Margaret, with her professional competence and obvious commitment to justice, Daniel with his protective concern for his sister and genuine care for my welfare, and Caroline, who'd survived an attempt on her life and was now risking herself again to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. "How do I contact you if something goes wrong?" Daniel handed me a business card that looked completely ordinary, except for a small symbol in one corner. "This number goes to a secure line that's monitored 24 hours a day. If you're in immediate danger, call and say you need a taxi to the airport. We'll know what that means and respond accordingly. And if you need to pass along information but can't talk freely, there's a coffee shop called Barista on Hawthorne Boulevard," Margaret added. "Order a vanilla latte with an extra shot and ask them to hold it for pickup under the name Jennifer. That'll signal us to check a dead drop location where you can leave information." The tradecraft felt surreal, like something from a spy movie rather than my actual life. But then again, nothing about my life had been real for the past 4 years, so perhaps it was fitting that reclaiming the truth would require playing a role. "I need to know one thing," I said, looking directly at Caroline. "Why are you risking this? You escaped, you built a new life, you have a husband who loves you and a baby on the way. Why come back and expose yourself to danger again?" Caroline was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "Because I spent 2 years in therapy learning to live with what they did to me, and another 2 years building the courage to fight back. Because Lisa Martinez deserved better than to die quietly while they collected insurance money and moved on to their next victim. And because you deserve the chance to reclaim your life the way I've reclaimed mine." She paused, then added, "But mostly because I realize that surviving isn't enough. Justice matters, truth matters, and sometimes the only way to heal from something is to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Her words settled into my chest like a warm weight, giving me courage I didn't know I possessed. I thought about the woman I'd been when I walked into Meridian Grill the night before, desperate to please a family that was planning my death, grateful for scraps of affection from people who saw me as disposable. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required fighting back. "Okay," I said, the word coming out stronger than I felt. "I'll do it. I'll go back and get you the evidence you need." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "I had a feeling you would." Caroline said she thought you were stronger than you knew. "What's my timeline?" "We need you to make contact with Brandon today," Margaret said, checking her watch. "The longer you're away, the more suspicious they'll become. Go home, act confused and hurt but willing to work things out, and start documenting everything immediately." Caroline reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "I want you to have this," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a delicate silver pendant on a thin chain, small and unremarkable except for the tiny camera lens hidden in its center. "It's functional jewelry," she explained with a smile. "Records video and audio, has a GPS tracker, and will send an automatic distress signal if it detects rapid acceleration or impact. Think of it as insurance." I fastened the pendant around my neck, the weight of it oddly comforting. It was a tangible reminder that I wasn't alone, that people were watching out for me, that my safety mattered to someone other than myself. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked, his expression serious. I thought about Caroline's courage in surviving that night in the river, about Lisa Martinez who'd never gotten the chance to fight back, about all the women who might be targeted if the Hayes family wasn't stopped. I thought about the woman I wanted to become versus the woman I'd been trained to be. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in days I meant it completely. The drive back to Hillsdale felt like traveling through a foreign country where everything looked familiar but nothing meant what I thought it did. Every street corner held memories that now seemed like scenes from someone else's life, performed by an actress who'd believed her role was real. The Victorian house that had been my home for 4 years looked smaller somehow, less substantial, as if learning the truth about its owners had diminished its very architecture. Brandon's Mercedes was in the driveway, along with Robert's black BMW and Patricia's silver Lexus. The entire Hayes family was gathered, no doubt strategizing how to handle the crisis Caroline's return had created. I sat in my Honda for several minutes, checking the recording device Daniel had given me, making sure Caroline's pendant was positioned correctly, and mentally rehearsing the performance I was about to give. The front door opened before I could reach it, Brandon appearing with an expression of relief so genuine it almost made me believe he actually cared about my welfare. "Rachel, thank God you're okay. We've been worried sick." He reached for me and I forced myself not to recoil from his touch, instead allowing him to pull me into what looked like a loving embrace. "I needed some time to think," I said, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. "Last night was so overwhelming, so confusing. I couldn't process everything that woman was saying." "Of course you couldn't." Patricia's voice came from behind Brandon as she appeared in the doorway. Caroline always had a gift for manipulation, for twisting the truth to serve her own purposes. "Come inside, dear. We have so much to explain." The living room felt different now that I understood its true purpose. This wasn't a family gathering place, it was a war room where 3 people planned murders and managed the aftermath. The expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork weren't expressions of taste. They were props in an elaborate performance designed to project respectability while hiding monstrous crimes. Robert stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. "That woman has been planning this for years," he said without preamble, building an elaborate revenge fantasy because she couldn't accept that Brandon had moved on with his life. "But she showed me documents," I said carefully, allowing confusion to color my voice. "Marriage certificates, insurance policies. How could she have forged all of that?" Brandon guided me to the sofa, his hand gentle on my back in a gesture that once would have comforted me. Now it felt like a predator checking to make sure his prey was properly positioned. Caroline was always clever with computers, with manipulating documents. She worked in graphic design before we married. She had all the skills necessary to create convincing forgeries. The insurance policies were particularly creative, Patricia added, settling into her usual chair with practiced grace. She somehow accessed old company letterhead, created fake policy numbers, even went so far as to forge signatures. It's actually quite impressive, in a disturbed sort of way. I marveled at how smoothly they wove their lies, how each family member contributed pieces to a narrative that painted Caroline as unstable and vindictive while positioning themselves as victims of her elaborate deception. If I hadn't seen the evidence myself, hadn't spoken to Margaret and Daniel, I might have been convinced by their performance. "But why would she do all this?" I asked, playing the role of the confused wife seeking understanding from the people she trusted most. "What could she possibly gain?" "Money," Robert said bluntly. "She's been living under an assumed identity for years, probably accumulating debts, making poor choices. She sees Brandon's success, our family's position in the community, and she wants what she thinks should have been hers." She also mentioned being pregnant, Brandon added, his voice carefully modulated to suggest both sympathy and skepticism. "If that's even true, she's probably desperate for financial support. Coming back from the dead with a sob story about being victimized is her way of trying to extract money from us." The ease with which they dismissed Caroline's pregnancy as either fabricated or mercenary made my skin crawl. These people were incapable of recognizing genuine emotion or authentic relationships because they'd spent so long manipulating both for their own purposes. "I'm scared," I admitted, and this part wasn't acting. "If she's really as unstable as you're saying, what's to stop her from doing something dangerous? She seemed so angry last night, so focused on destroying our family." Patricia leaned forward with maternal concern that would have been touching if I didn't know she was planning my murder. "That's exactly why we need to be very careful about how we handle this situation, dear. Caroline is clearly not thinking rationally, and desperate people can be unpredictable. We've already contacted our attorney," Robert said, moving to his desk and retrieving a business card. "Jonathan Steele specializes in cases involving harassment and false accusations. He'll know how to protect us legally while we figure out the best way to deal with Caroline's instability." I took the card, noting the name for Margaret's investigation. Should I be worried about my safety? The way she looked at me last night, it felt almost threatening. "We won't let anything happen to you," Brandon said firmly, taking my hand in what appeared to be a protective gesture. "But it might be wise for you to vary your routines for a while, avoid being alone in public places, that sort of thing." The irony of Brandon warning me about my safety while his family planned my death was so complete it took all my self-control not to laugh hysterically. Instead, I squeezed his hand and looked at him with the trusting expression he expected from his devoted wife. What about the police? Shouldn't we report what happened last night? The three Hayes family members exchanged a look so brief I almost missed it, but the recording device would catch every micro-expression for later analysis. We've already spoken to Detective Morrison, Patricia said smoothly. He's aware of the situation and agrees that the best approach is to document Caroline's behavior without escalating things unnecessarily. Detective Morrison, not Detective Hayes. They'd found a new corrupt official to help cover their tracks, someone who could be trusted to mishandle any investigation just like William Hayes had done 4 years ago. The network of corruption was deeper and more sophisticated than even Margaret had suspected. I should probably get back to work tomorrow, I said, testing their reaction. Try to maintain some normalcy while this gets sorted out. Actually, Brandon said carefully, I was thinking you might want to take some time off. This has been traumatic for you, and having Caroline out there making wild accusations is going to be stressful. Maybe we could take a little vacation, get away from Portland until things calm down. A vacation? Away from witnesses, away from my support network, in some isolated location where an accident would seem perfectly plausible. The suggestion made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to consider it with the innocent enthusiasm they expected. That might be nice, I said slowly. Where were you thinking? Remember that cabin we looked at in the Cascade Mountains last summer? Patricia suggested. The one with the beautiful views but those winding mountain roads. I could call the owner, see if it's available this week. The same type of mountain roads where Lisa Martinez had died in her convenient single-car accident. They weren't even being subtle about their intentions anymore. They were so confident in their ability to manipulate me that they were essentially describing my planned murder to my face. The Cascades are beautiful this time of year, I agreed, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. But maybe we should wait until this situation with Caroline is completely resolved. I'd hate to be relaxing in the mountains while she's out there spreading lies about our family. You're probably right, Brandon said, though I caught the flash of disappointment in his eyes. We should deal with this head-on rather than running away from it. Robert moved to the bar cart and poured himself a scotch, the action casual but somehow ominous. The important thing is that we stick together as a family. Caroline is counting on being able to divide us, to make you doubt what you know about Brandon and about us. We can't let her succeed. I would never doubt you, I said, looking around the room at the three people who'd planned to make me their third murder victim. You're the only family I have now. Whatever Caroline's real motives are, whatever she's trying to accomplish, I know you'll protect me. The satisfaction on their faces was nauseating. They believed they'd successfully reinforced my dependency on them, convinced me to trust their version of events over the evidence of my own eyes. In their minds, I was back under control, properly positioned for whatever came next in their timeline. There is one thing, I said hesitantly, as if the thought had just occurred to me. My car's been making strange noises lately, especially when I brake. Maybe I should have it looked at before Caroline tries anything desperate. The silence that followed my comment was deafening. Brandon's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on mine, while Patricia's smile became fixed in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Robert took a longer sip of his scotch than necessary, buying time to formulate a response. Strange noises? Brandon asked, his voice carefully neutral. It's probably nothing, I said with a laugh that sounded convincingly nervous. I'm probably just being paranoid because of everything that's happened. But the brake pedal felt soft this morning, and there was this weird scraping sound when I came to a stop. You should definitely have that checked out, Patricia said quickly. There's a wonderful mechanic we use, very reliable and trustworthy. I'll get you his number. Web Auto Repair, no doubt. They were going to send me directly to the man they'd hired to sabotage my car, probably with instructions to make sure the job was completed properly this time. The audacity of it was breathtaking. That would be great, I said gratefully. I'd feel so much better knowing the car was safe, especially with Caroline out there acting unpredictably. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it reflexively. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. Thinking of you during this difficult time. Stay strong. A friend. Brandon's eyes fixed on my phone screen with laser intensity. Who's that from? I don't know, I said honestly, showing him the message. Probably someone who was at the restaurant last night. Word travels fast in Portland's social circles. You should be careful about responding to messages from unknown numbers, Robert said gravely. Caroline might be trying to contact you indirectly, to feed you more of her lies without having to confront you face to face, or she might have convinced someone else to help her, Patricia added. People can be very gullible when presented with a sob story, especially if it involves claims of domestic violence or family conspiracy. The way they were spinning every potential source of support into a threat was masterful. They were systematically isolating me from anyone who might offer help or alternative perspectives, reinforcing the idea that they were my only reliable allies in a dangerous situation. I won't respond to any strange messages, I promised, and I'll let you know immediately if Caroline tries to contact me directly. Good girl, Robert said approvingly, and the condescending tone made my skin crawl. The most important thing is communication. We need to know everything Caroline does, everyone she talks to, every move she makes. Only then can we protect ourselves and you. Brandon stood and moved to the window, ostensibly checking the street but actually positioning himself where he could monitor any approaching vehicles. I think one of us should stay here tonight, he said, just in case Caroline decides to escalate things. That's not necessary, I said quickly, though not too quickly. She seemed more interested in making a public scene than an actual confrontation. And besides, we have the security system. The security system that she probably knows how to disable, Patricia pointed out. Remember, she lived in this house for 2 years. She knows all our routines, all our vulnerabilities. The irony was perfect. They were using their own intimate knowledge of the house and my routines to justify surveillance that would actually help them monitor my activities and ensure I didn't have opportunities to contact outside help. Maybe you're right, I conceded. It would make me feel safer to have someone here. I'll stay, Brandon volunteered immediately. This is my mess to clean up, and you shouldn't have to deal with the consequences of my past alone. His past. As if Caroline's near murder was something that had simply happened to him rather than something he'd actively participated in planning and executing. The way he reframed their crimes as personal inconveniences rather than attempted homicides was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. What about tomorrow? I asked. Should I go to work, try to maintain normal routines, or would that be too risky? I think normal routines are important, Patricia said thoughtfully. But perhaps someone should escort you, just until we know what Caroline's planning. I could accompany you to work, make sure you arrive safely. A chaperone. They were assigning me a chaperone to ensure I didn't have opportunities to meet with allies or gather evidence they didn't control. The suggestion was presented as protection, but I recognized it for what it really was. House arrest disguised as concern. That might be smart, I agreed. At least for the first few days, until we know how serious this threat really is. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I showed the screen to Brandon, who nodded grimly. Don't answer it, he instructed. Let it go to voicemail, and we'll listen to the message together. The call went to voicemail as instructed, and within moments my phone chimed with a notification. I played the message on speaker, all 4 of us listening intently to what turned out to be a robocall about extended car warranties. The anticlimax was almost comical, but the Hayes family's reaction told me everything I needed to know about their current stress level. We're all on edge, I said sympathetically. This situation has everyone jumping at shadows. It's exactly what Caroline wants, Robert said grimly. To make us paranoid, to disrupt our lives, to turn us against each other. She's playing psychological warfare, and we can't let her win. The projection was staggering. They were the ones playing psychological warfare, but they'd convinced themselves that Caroline was the aggressor and they were the victims. In their twisted worldview, surviving their murder attempt and seeking justice made her the villain in the story. I should probably call in sick tomorrow, I said, changing tactics. Give myself time to process all this before I have to face people at work who might have heard about what happened at the restaurant. That's probably wise, Brandon agreed. No point in subjecting yourself to gossip and speculation when you're already dealing with so much stress. Perfect. They wanted me isolated and available, presumably so they could accelerate their timeline without having to worry about my absence being noticed immediately. The more eager they were to keep me away from work and social obligations, the more urgent their plans were becoming. I think I'll take a bath and try to get some sleep, I said, standing and stretching as if exhaustion was finally catching up with me. This has been the longest day of my life. Of course, darling, Patricia said warmly, you need your rest. Tomorrow we'll start fresh, with a clear plan for handling this situation. Brandon kissed my cheek as I headed toward the stairs, the gesture automatic and performed for his parents' benefit rather than out of any genuine affection. "I'll be right behind you," he said. "Just want to finish discussing security arrangements with Mom and Dad." Security arrangements. They were planning my murder and calling it security arrangements. The euphemistic language they used to discuss their crimes was almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. In our bedroom, I went through the motions of preparing for sleep while listening carefully to the muffled conversation happening downstairs. The recording devices would capture everything, but I wanted to hear as much as possible in real time. Unfortunately, they were speaking too quietly for me to make out specific words, though the urgent tone was unmistakable. I ran water for a bath, using the sound as cover while I quickly typed a message on the secure phone Daniel had given me. "Back in the house. They're planning something urgent. Mentioned vacation to Cascade Mountains and recommended auto mechanic, family meeting happening now downstairs." The response came within minutes. "Understood. Recording everything. Stay safe. Exit strategy ready if needed." Knowing that help was just a phone call away made the performance slightly easier to maintain, but it also highlighted how precarious my situation really was. I was sleeping in the same house as 3 people who'd already killed at least one woman and were actively planning to kill me, protected only by their belief that I was still under their control. The bath was actually soothing, giving me time to think through everything I'd learned and plan my approach for the days ahead. The Hayes family was clearly accelerating their timeline, probably because Caroline's public return had made them nervous about leaving loose ends unresolved. That meant I had very little time to gather the evidence Margaret needed for federal prosecutors. Brandon appeared in the bathroom doorway just as I was getting out of the tub, his expression carefully arranged to suggest loving concern rather than the calculating assessment I now recognized it as. "Feeling better?" he asked. "A little," I said, wrapping myself in the plush towel that was probably paid for with Lisa Martinez's life insurance money. "Did you and your parents come up with a plan?" "We're going to take things day by day," he said vaguely. "The important thing is keeping you safe while we figure out the best way to deal with Caroline's harassment." Harassment. They were calling attempted murder charges and demands for justice harassment. The way they minimized their crimes was as revealing as any confession. "I keep thinking about what she said," I admitted, sitting at the vanity and brushing my hair with deliberate slowness. "About being pregnant. About having a new husband. If any of that's true, why would she risk everything to come back here?" Brandon's reflection in the mirror showed a moment of genuine confusion, as if he truly couldn't understand why someone would seek justice for attempted murder. "Some people can't let go of the past," he said finally. "They get so caught up in old grievances that they lose sight of reality. But if she really thought you'd tried to kill her, wouldn't she have gone to the police years ago instead of disappearing?" "Caroline never trusted authority figures," Brandon said, and for the first time his voice carried what sounded like authentic memory rather than manufactured explanation. "She had this paranoid streak, always convinced that people in power were corrupt or compromised. It would be just like her to spend years building some elaborate case instead of trusting the system to work properly." The irony was perfect. Caroline's supposed paranoia about corrupt authority figures had been completely justified, given that Detective William Hayes had covered up the initial investigation. But Brandon seemed genuinely unaware of how his explanation actually supported Caroline's credibility rather than undermining it. "What was she like?" I asked, genuinely curious about the woman whose life I'd been recruited to replace. "Before things went wrong between you, what drew you to her?" Brandon was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more reflective than I'd heard it in years. "She was fearless," he said. "Caroline would try anything, go anywhere, challenge anyone if she thought they were wrong about something. She made me feel like I could be more than just another Hayes family heir following the prescribed path." "That sounds wonderful. What changed?" Another long pause, and when Brandon answered, I heard something that might have been genuine regret. She started asking too many questions about the family business, wanting to know details about transactions and clients that weren't really her concern. Mom and Dad felt like she was overstepping boundaries, trying to insert herself into affairs that should remain private. "What kind of questions?" "Financial stuff, mostly." She'd worked in graphic design but had taken some accounting courses, and she noticed discrepancies in some of the records she'd seen. She became convinced that Dad was involved in something illegal, that the family money wasn't as clean as it appeared. The admission slipped out before Brandon seemed to realize what he was revealing. Caroline hadn't been unstable or paranoid, she'd been perceptive. She'd recognized that Robert's business practices were questionable and had made the mistake of voicing her concerns to the family that was profiting from those practices. Was she right? I asked carefully. Brandon's expression hardened, the moment of nostalgic honesty disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Caroline had a tendency to see conspiracies where none existed, he said firmly. Dad's business is completely legitimate, always has been. But once Caroline got an idea in her head, she couldn't let it go. She became obsessed with proving theories that had no basis in reality. The conversation was being recorded, which meant Brandon had just provided evidence that Caroline had discovered illegal activities and that her concerns had been dismissed by the family. Combined with everything else Margaret and Daniel had gathered, it was another piece of the puzzle that would help federal prosecutors understand the motive for her attempted murder. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that," I said sympathetically. "It must have been heartbreaking to watch someone you loved become so suspicious and paranoid." "It was," Brandon agreed, settling into bed beside me. "Which is why I'm not going to let Caroline destroy what we've built together. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Rachel. I won't lose you to her twisted need for revenge." The words would have been touching if I didn't know they were being spoken by someone who was actively planning my death. Instead, they felt like a eulogy being delivered prematurely. Brandon's way of justifying my upcoming murder as a noble sacrifice to protect our fictional happiness. "I love you too," I said, the lie tasting like poison in my mouth. "Whatever happens with Caroline, we'll face it together." Brandon kissed me goodnight, and I forced myself not to recoil from the touch of lips that belonged to someone who saw me as a problem to be eliminated, rather than a person to be cherished. As he settled into sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about Caroline surviving that night in the river. About Lisa Martinez, who hadn't been given the chance to fight back. About all the women who might be targeted if I failed to gather the evidence needed to stop the Hayes family permanently. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to document their crimes, and new dangers as they moved closer to implementing whatever timeline they'd established for my elimination. But tonight, surrounded by people who wanted me dead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the fierce determination that comes from finally understanding exactly what you're fighting for. The morning brought an urgency to the Hayes household that I could feel the moment I opened my eyes. Brandon was already dressed and on his phone, speaking in the hushed tones he used for conversations he didn't want me to overhear. Through the bedroom window I could see Robert pacing in the garden with his own phone pressed to his ear, his gestures sharp and agitated. "Morning, darling," Patricia called from downstairs, her voice unnaturally bright. "I've made your favorite breakfast. We should eat quickly. I've scheduled that appointment with the mechanic for 10 o'clock. Web auto repair, no doubt." They were moving fast, faster than I'd expected. The recording device captured everything as I made my way downstairs, noting how the family's behavior had shifted overnight from calculated concern to barely contained panic. "Sleep well?" Brandon asked, ending his call abruptly when I entered the kitchen. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent most of the night awake, probably coordinating with his parents about accelerating their timeline. "Better than expected," I lied, accepting the coffee Patricia offered. "Though I keep having strange dreams about that woman showing up everywhere I go." "Trauma manifests in different ways," Patricia said sympathetically, though her attention was clearly divided. She kept glancing at her phone, checking for messages or updates that would determine their next moves. Robert joined us from the garden, his face grim with whatever news he'd received during his phone call. "We may need to move up our vacation plans," he announced without preamble. "Jonathan Steele thinks it would be best if you were out of town while he handles the legal aspects of Caroline's harassment campaign. A vacation that would coincidentally place me on dangerous mountain roads with a car that had been professionally sabotaged." The suggestion was so transparent it took all my self-control not to react with the horror it deserved. "How soon?" I asked, playing the part of the worried wife seeking guidance from her trusted family. "This afternoon, if possible," Brandon said, his voice tight with manufactured urgency. "Jonathan got word that Caroline might be planning some kind of media campaign, trying to take her lies public. It would be better if you weren't here to be ambushed by reporters or photographers." Media campaign. Caroline was probably working with Margaret to present their evidence to federal authorities, but the Hayes family was spinning it as malicious publicity seeking. Their ability to reframe every legitimate action as a threat was truly masterful. "That makes sense," I agreed, though my pulse was racing. "But shouldn't we get my car fixed first? I'd hate to break down on mountain roads." Already arranged, Patricia said quickly. Marcus Webb can have your car ready within the hour. He's a miracle worker with brake systems. Marcus Webb. They were saying his name openly now, so confident in their control over me that they weren't bothering to maintain even basic operational security. The recording device was capturing everything, building an airtight case against all three conspirators. I should pack, I said, standing from the breakfast table. What kind of weather should I expect in the mountains? Cool nights, warm days, Robert said distractedly, already pulling up something on his phone. But don't pack too much. We can buy anything you need when we get there. Don't pack too much because I wouldn't be coming back. The instruction was delivered so casually it almost sounded like genuine travel advice rather than preparation for murder. Upstairs, I moved quickly but carefully, selecting items that would seem normal while ensuring I had everything I needed for whatever came next. The secure phone went into a hidden pocket of my jacket. Caroline's pendant remained around my neck, and the original recording device was tucked into my purse where it would capture audio even if they searched my luggage. I also grabbed my passport and the few pieces of valuable jewelry I owned, though I tried to make it look like casual packing rather than preparation for permanent departure. If things went wrong and I needed to run, I wanted to have options. My phone buzzed with a text from the unknown number that had contacted me yesterday. Beautiful day for a drive. Enjoy the scenic routes. It was clearly a coded message from Daniel or Margaret, letting me know they were monitoring the situation and ready to intervene if necessary. Who's that from? Brandon asked, appearing in the doorway with suspicious timing. Same unknown number as yesterday, I said, showing him the message. Should I be worried? Definitely Caroline or one of her allies, he said grimly. She's trying to intimidate you, make you feel like you're being watched. It's classic psychological manipulation. The irony was staggering. Brandon was describing his own family's tactics while attributing them to Caroline, apparently unaware of how accurately he was diagnosing his own criminal behavior. I'm scared, I admitted, and this time the emotion was completely genuine. What if she follows us to the mountains? What if she's planning to hurt me when I'm away from the security of home? We won't let that happen, Brandon said firmly, pulling me into an embrace that felt like a trap closing around me. You're safe with us, Rachel. We'll protect you from Caroline and anyone else who tries to hurt our family. The drive to Webb Auto Repair took place in Brandon's Mercedes, with Patricia following in her Lexus to provide my ride home after the car was supposedly fixed. The garage was located in an industrial section of southeast Portland, surrounded by warehouses and auto salvage yards that would provide perfect privacy for completing the sabotage of my brake system. Marcus Webb was exactly what I'd expected. A thin man with greasy hands and calculating eyes, who looked more like a criminal than a legitimate mechanic. He greeted Brandon with the familiarity of someone who'd done business with the Hayes family before, though they kept their conversation brief and professional for my benefit. Brake problems, huh? Webb said, walking around my Honda with the practiced eye of someone evaluating a target rather than diagnosing a mechanical issue. Happens more often than people think, especially on older vehicles. Good thing you caught it before taking any long trips. How long will it take to fix? I asked innocently. Couple hours at most, Webb replied, already signaling to one of his employees. We'll have you back on the road in no time, guaranteed. Back on the road and heading toward my death if their plan succeeded. But as we drove away from the garage, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The end game was finally here, which meant the elaborate performance I'd been maintaining was almost over. I need to stop at home and finish packing, I told Patricia as we drove through Portland's familiar streets. And maybe call work to let them know I'll be taking a few additional days off. Good thinking, she agreed. Though you might want to be vague about where you're going, just in case Caroline has people watching or listening. Caroline has people watching. Patricia was absolutely right about that, though not in the way she imagined. Margaret, Daniel, and their federal contacts were monitoring everything, ready to intervene the moment I gave the signal or failed to check in as scheduled. Back at the house, I went through the motions of final preparations while listening to the family make last-minute arrangements downstairs, phone calls to the mountain cabin, discussions about timing and routes, casual conversations about weather conditions that sounded ominous when you understood their real purpose. My secure phone vibrated with an incoming message, vehicle tracking active, support units positioned along all mountain routes. Safe word is Oregon Trail if you need immediate extraction. The reassurance that help was close gave me the courage to continue the charade, though every minute felt like an eternity as I waited for Webb to complete his sabotage and for the Hayes family to finalize their murder plot. At noon, Brandon returned from the garage with my Honda, now equipped with brake lines that would fail at precisely the wrong moment on exactly the right stretch of mountain road. "All fixed," he announced cheerfully. "Marcus said your instincts were right. The brake fluid was contaminated and the lines were showing signs of wear. Could have been dangerous if you'd ignored it much longer. Dangerous if I'd ignored it, fatal now that they'd fixed it." The audacity of their lies was breathtaking, matched only by their confidence that I would never live to expose the truth. "Ready for our adventure?" Patricia asked, appearing with a small overnight bag and car keys. "I thought I'd ride with you, keep you company on the drive up. Brandon and Robert can follow in the Mercedes." A chaperone for my final journey, someone to ensure I took exactly the route they'd planned, and to confirm my death when the brakes inevitably failed. Patricia was volunteering to be a witness to my murder, probably so she could provide a detailed account of the tragic accident that would satisfy insurance investigators. "That sounds perfect," I said, accepting my car keys from Brandon with hands that I forced to remain steady. "I feel so much better knowing you'll be there if anything goes wrong." "Nothing will go wrong," Brandon assured me, kissing my cheek with what would have seemed like loving concern to any observer. "It's going to be a beautiful, peaceful trip. Exactly what you need after all the stress of the past few days. A beautiful, peaceful trip that would end with my car going off a mountain road, and my body being found days later in a wreckage that would tell the story of another tragic brake failure. They'd probably establish a scholarship in my memory too, adding insult to injury just like they'd done with Lisa Martinez." The drive began innocuously enough, Patricia keeping up cheerful conversation about the scenery and the weather, while I navigated Portland's suburban streets toward the mountain highways. In my rearview mirror, I could see Brandon and Robert following at a discreet distance, close enough to respond if anything went wrong with their plan but far enough back to avoid being implicated in whatever was about to happen. "Such a lovely day for a drive," Patricia commented as we entered the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. "I'm so glad we decided to do this. Sometimes the best cure for stress is just getting away from everything familiar. Getting away from everything familiar, including witnesses who might ask inconvenient questions about my sudden disappearance." But as we climbed higher into the mountains, I noticed other vehicles maintaining steady distances behind us, unmarked cars with tinted windows that I strongly suspected contained Margaret's federal contacts. "The views up here are spectacular," I said, testing my brakes gently as we approached a series of switchbacks. The pedal felt normal for now, but I knew that would change as we reached the specific stretch of road the Hayes family had chosen for my elimination. "Wait until you see the cabin," Patricia replied enthusiastically. "It's perched right on the edge of a cliff, with views that go on forever. So peaceful, so private. The perfect place to forget about all your troubles. The perfect place to die without witnesses," she meant. But I was done being their victim, done playing the role of the naive wife who trusted her murderous in-laws. As we rounded the next curve, I made my decision. "Oregon Trail," I said clearly, speaking directly toward the recording device in my purse. Patricia looked at me strangely. "What did you say, dear?" I said. "This reminds me of the Oregon Trail," I improvised quickly. "All these mountain roads and scenic vistas. Makes you think about pioneers traveling through dangerous territory." "How poetic," Patricia murmured, though her attention was now focused on her phone, probably checking with Brandon about our progress toward whatever kill zone they'd selected. Within minutes, I saw the first sign that help was coming. A helicopter appeared in the distance, flying low and fast toward our position. Patricia noticed it too, her expression shifting from casual interest to sudden concern. "That's odd," she said. "You don't usually see helicopters out here unless there's been an accident or emergency. Maybe someone needs medical evacuation," I suggested innocently, though my heart was racing with the knowledge that my ordeal was finally approaching its end. The helicopter was followed by a convoy of black SUVs that appeared on the road behind us, moving much faster than normal traffic and clearly heading in our direction. In my rearview mirror, I could see Brandon's Mercedes being pulled over by what looked like federal agents, their emergency lights flashing as they surrounded the vehicle. "Something's wrong," Patricia said, her voice sharp with sudden panic. "Pull over, Rachel. Pull over right now." "Why?" I asked, though I was already steering toward the shoulder of the road. "What's happening?" "I don't know, but we need to." Her words were cut off as federal agents surrounded my Honda, their weapons drawn and badges clearly visible. Through my window, I could see Margaret Chen approaching with a team of FBI agents, her expression grim but determined. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible," one of the agents commanded through a megaphone. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I complied immediately, raising my hands and exiting the car with obvious relief. Patricia remained frozen in the passenger seat, her face white with shock as she realized that her carefully planned murder had become a federal arrest operation. "Rachel Thompson?" Margaret asked, approaching with what looked like an arrest warrant. "That's me," I confirmed, pulling the recording device from my purse and the pendant from around my neck. "I believe you'll find these recordings very interesting." Margaret smiled grimly as she accepted the evidence. "Patricia Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. You have the right to remain silent." As the agents read Patricia her rights and placed her in custody, I could see similar scenes playing out behind us where Brandon and Robert were being arrested with the same professional efficiency. Years of careful planning, multiple murders, and elaborate cover-ups were all coming to an end on a mountain road that was supposed to be my final destination. "Are you injured?" one of the paramedics asked, checking me over despite my protests that I was fine. "Physically, no," I said, watching as my sabotaged Honda was loaded onto a federal evidence truck. "But I think it's going to take some time to process everything that's happened." Caroline appeared at my side as if summoned by magic, her face bright with relief, and something that looked like justice finally served. "You did it," she said simply. "You stopped them." "We stopped them," I corrected, accepting the hug she offered. "All of us together." Daniel joined us moments later, grinning broadly as he watched federal agents process the crime scene. "The recordings you gathered were perfect," he said. "Combined with everything else we'd collected, it's an airtight case. They're going to prison for a very long time." "What happens now?" I asked, looking down at the valley below where Portland spread out in the afternoon sunlight. My old life was down there somewhere, along with everything I'd thought I wanted. But standing on this mountain with people who'd risked everything to save my life, I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. "Now you get to decide who you want to become," Caroline said gently. "The Federal Witness Protection Program will give you a new identity if you want one, or you can reclaim your old life with the Hayes family permanently out of the picture. Either way, you're free to make your own choices." Free. The word felt foreign after years of having my decisions shaped by people who saw me as disposable. But as I watched the last of the Hayes family being driven away in federal custody, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: the unlimited possibility that comes with genuine freedom. "I think," I said slowly, "I'd like to start by figuring out who Rachel Thompson really is when she's not trying to be someone else's idea of the perfect wife." Caroline laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the mountain air. "That sounds like an excellent place to begin." 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Seattle, watching as Brandon Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Patricia and Robert received similar sentences, their network of corruption dismantled, and their assets seized to compensate their victims. The Hayes family legacy of murder and manipulation had ended with 3 consecutive life sentences and a federal investigation that had exposed corruption reaching deep into Portland's business and political establishments. Caroline sat beside me in the courtroom, her baby daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The child would grow up knowing the truth about her family's past, but protected from its darkness, surrounded by people who valued honesty over image and love over control. "Any regrets?" Caroline asked as we left the courthouse together. I thought about the question seriously, considering everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. The woman who'd walked into Meridian Grill for her anniversary dinner was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more authentic. The marriage I'd thought was perfect had been revealed as a fraud, but I'd discovered allies who genuinely cared about my welfare. The life I'd built in Portland had crumbled, but I'd gained the freedom to build something real in its place. "None," I said finally, and meant it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.